Hello everyone, my name is Rhys Kościński. This is Simple Philosophy, where we simplify philosophers to help you better understand life. Today, we're going to be talking about Freud. In this video, I'm going to be joined by psychology lecturer Fran Wade, who's going to be taking us through some of Freud's key concepts, including the unconscious, the structure of personality, psychosexual types of development, as well as the structure of personality too. If you're interested in any of these concepts, there's a breakdown of the video with timestamps in the description. And without further ado, let's get into it. Hey, Fran, how you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right, thank you. So you're going to be taking us through Freud today?
Yes.
Absolutely. So let's take a look at some of these key concepts that we're going to be looking at in today's lecture. So first of all, we're going to be looking at who Freud was and maybe some of a basic introduction to what psychoanalysis is. We'll take a look at the model of the unconscious. We'll take a look at the structure of personality, and then that will link us into different defense mechanisms. And then we'll take a look at the psychosexual stages of development, which includes the Oedipus complex and Electra complex, if you ever came for either of those. So let's get into it, shall we? So the first thing we need to know about Freud is actually understanding what psychoanalysis is. And essentially, psychoanalysis is the idea that our behavior is controlled by unconscious drives, that there are unconscious, private, inaccessible parts of our mind which control our desires, our understandings, and our relationships.
Sometimes the things that are trapped in the unconscious actually lead to quite minor mental health conditions such as anxiety and panic attacks, and sometimes depression as well. So the way that Freud would explain this is he would say that our unconscious uses defense mechanisms to try and cope with sort of negative emotions in our life. So if we're feeling embarrassed or we're feeling guilty about something, our unconscious would cause us to use a defense mechanism to try and cope with it. Now, if we use too many coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms, this actually then eventually will lead to mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety. So the way that it sort of manifests itself is through anxiety.
Absolutely. And one of the ways Freud wants us to deal with these potential issues that come up in the unconscious is to actually open up the unconscious itself and face these repressed desires or memories. What techniques does Freud have for covering these, Fran?
So he uses quite a few different techniques, but the main one is free association. And this could be where he gets the patient to just talk openly about what is on their mind, or he might or she might just sort of say certain words such as relationships or work, and the patient would have to say the first thing that comes into their head. So if I said to my patient relationships, that person might say things like trapped or struggling, and then they would sort of explore the reasons why they said those words in response to it.
So another key kind of case for Freud is the study of Anna O. And I wondered if you'd be willing to just expand a little bit on the case of Anna O for us.
Yeah, so when Freud first started out, he was actually a neurologist, which means that he studied and tried to treat patients who had problems with their nervous system, basically. So a lot of his patients suffered with maybe paralysis of their arms or their legs. They couldn't move them, so they would go to Freud to try and fix it. There was also, because Freud was around in about the 1890s, this is when he started to develop his theories. At that time, there was a disorder called hysteria, which is a really, really interesting disorder that you might want to have a really good look into if you're interested. But it was basically like a catch-all term for any sort of unexplained symptoms that a woman was having. So if a woman was having paralysis of her limbs, or she was, I think there was like too much emotion. If she was suffering from too much emotion, that was a problem. We need to label that problem. It's hysteria. And at the time, there was lots of different ways of treating this condition that only seemed to affect women.
Yeah, am I right in thinking that historically it used to be treated by essentially getting the woman off?
Yes, that apparently was one way of treating it. But by the time Freud came in to treat hysteria, he worked with hypnosis. So he actually worked under a man called Joseph Breuer, and they would both try and hypnotize the patient, treat the disorder that way. It didn't work quite a lot of the time, but the way that Anna O comes in is she was like a really, really important figure for Freud, because when she was under her hypnosis, she would talk about these sort of really bad memories from her childhood. So she talked about when her father was ill. I think she talked about having a really bad experience with a dog, so she had a phobia of dogs. She talked about that. And then once she'd come out of the hypnosis, her symptoms actually seemed to go away a little bit. So Freud noticed that when she opened up about certain sort of really negative things that happened in her past that were more disturbing to her,
almost like when she addresses those particular things that she's repressing.
Yeah,
or
so when
kind of addresses her fears in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So when she sort of brought to the surface these more repressed memories, that is when the symptoms seem to disappear. So that's what started Freud off on his idea of things being repressed and pushed away because they're negative, and then these sort of causing symptoms later on in life.
So essentially, you're going to have to face your fears and deal with it at some point in order to mature. At some point to mature to this kind of psychologically sound stage in life.
Yeah.
So one of the first things that we need to discuss is obviously Freud's model of the unconscious. Now, I also discussed this in a video lecture that we did on Marx, where we're looking at how ideology functions in our unconscious mind. But here I just want to focus in on Freud's model as a whole. Now, Freud uses the metaphor of an iceberg to describe how the unconscious actually functions, where we're just above the water, we have the peak of the iceberg, which is what we can clearly see. At the lower level, which we can see through the water, we have another level of the iceberg, but then the biggest part of the iceberg actually goes deep into the water, which we cannot actually see. And Freud uses this as the perfect model for the unconscious. Now, the conscious part of the mind is the bit that sticks up above the water. And these are thoughts that we instantly have, such as recording a video is extremely weird, such as I am bored, I need the toilet, I am hungry. These are all things that we can immediately think of and that we know we are thinking. We are conscious of them. So this is the conscious part of our mind, that we know what we are thinking in that particular moment. We then have the pre-conscious part of the brain, which is the next level down. And these are essentially thoughts or memories that are not accessible at all time, but you can easily recall. The best example we can use would be riding a bike. I'm not thinking about riding a bike right now, but when I get my bike out, I automatically know how to ride it. And as we've probably not driven for quite a while since we've been in lockdown, I'm not thinking about how to drive a car right now, but when we get back into the car, it will bubble to the surface and we will be able to do it again. Finally, the biggest part of the mind is the unconscious. And this is the part of the iceberg that is deep in the ocean, that we cannot see, that we are not necessarily aware of, but it has an impact on our psyche.
An example of how the unconscious affects you is you might have certain sort of unacceptable feelings towards, let's say, a family member, let's say a brother. So you absolutely hate your brother, but that is not acceptable to express this anger towards your brother. So instead, the way that you deal with that is you push that emotion down and you push it away and you try to ignore it. And then that sort of energy goes deep down into the unconscious. But it doesn't just stop there. That sort of energy will still affect your actions, but in a much more unconscious way. So you don't really know that you're expressing anger, but it's still coming out in some sort of behavior.
Yeah, it's almost something that's happening underneath. And so what Freud is aiming to do, as we mentioned previously, is he's trying to get these feelings to bubble to the surface so we can address them consciously and that we can move on and away from our problems.
So if you look back at that iceberg model that Reese was just showing, you'll have seen that it had some words on it that were ego, superego, and then id as well. So yeah, and you'll see that the superego is mostly unconscious, but there's a little bit that's conscious. With the ego, that again is a little bit pre-conscious, but also there's a little bit above the surface that you are aware of. And then we've got this id, which is completely submerged in the unconscious. What Freud said was that throughout the first few years of life, we develop the id, the ego, and the superego. So if we start with the id, you can think of this as like the pleasure principle. When babies are born, they are purely id. It's just like instinctual drives that just want pleasure. They want instant gratification. If you've ever been around a baby, like in the first year of life, doesn't care about anyone else. It doesn't think about other people's needs. It just cries because it wants food, or it wants attention, or it's uncomfortable, or it's stressed. And it wants immediately for that stress to be taken away, or it immediately wants to be fed in order to satisfy it.
Sounds like people from Geordie Shore, to be honest with you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we want stuff straight away right now. So that's what we're born with. We're purely just like a bundle of id. Then as we start to grow older, our parents will sort of teach us that we need to think about other people's needs and their feelings as well. So this is where the superego comes in. So the superego is called the morality principle because it's the part of us that thinks, actually, I shouldn't do this, even though I want to, because it will hurt other people's feelings, or it will, it'll come off wrong, and it'll be damaging in some sort of way. So as we're growing up, we're developing morals, and we're starting to think, do you know what? I shouldn't just have this sort of instant gratification. I should think of other people as well. Finally, we've got the ego, which is you can kind of call it the reality principle, because the ego's job is to satisfy the id. So it is to try and get this pleasure and get this instant gratification, but it's also trying to satisfy the superego as well. So it's trying to get what we want, but in maybe a more acceptable way. So sometimes you can sort of imagine that the ego comes into a lot of conflict when it's trying to satisfy both the id and the superego. So sometimes what it has to do is it has to use defense mechanisms to try and put up with the conflict, or to try and reduce the conflict that it actually experiences.
So whilst the ego is trying to balance these two different parts of our brain, essentially, it needs to develop some sort of defense mechanisms in order to deal with the conflict or unwanted emotions that arise from these two different factors. And that if we overuse these mechanisms, it can potentially lead to issues of mental illness. So Fran has actually prepared for us a few examples of personality traits that develop as a result of the imbalance between these different sections. So the first of these that you've highlighted is denial. So what do you mean by denial, and what type of personality trait is this?
Right, so I think everybody would have heard of denial before, but denial is basically where you pretend that something is not happening. So let's take the coronavirus pandemic that is happening at the moment. Somebody might be in complete denial that this is a global thing. It can really hurt people. It can, really damage people's health and their family members. So they might just, as a way of sort of coping with the anxiety that would bring on, they just pretend it isn't happening. So they carry on going to Tesco, they carry on touching things and just like handling money and doing whatever they want that they would normally do, because the idea of actually coping with the anxiety of a pandemic would be too much.
So the next personality trait that we've identified is repression. And I think we thought of a few friends that we have that probably have this personality trait in them. So what's repression as a personality trait?
So this is probably the main defense mechanism that Freud came up with. So the idea of repression, it's quite similar to denial, but you have some sort of thought or wish or memory that again would bring you really uncomfortable feelings. So rather than dealing with the uncomfortable feelings, you just pretend that it's not happening. You sort of push it away and you try to forget about it. So for example, Darren in HR.
As you idly stare over the screen in your boring 9-to-5 job, you see Darren.
And you think, oh, he's nice. I wonder what he looks like. And then you think, that's wrong. I shouldn't think about him naked.
Yeah, he's married with kids and a wife. He doesn't need me coming in and home wrecking, so I must put this away.
Put it to bed, just ignore it, pretend it's not there.
we must repress this memory or this thought, as it is not socially acceptable.
Yeah.
The next personality trait that we've identified is displacement, and we've used an image here of Brad Pitt throwing his phone away. So do you want to take us into displacement?
Yeah, so displacement tends to be you've got certain feelings towards a person, but to actually express that feeling towards them would be completely unacceptable. So if you take maybe the brother example, you hate your brother, you've just had an argument with him, and all you want to do is just punch him in the face. that isn't socially acceptable. So instead, you displace that anger towards an object that is maybe inanimate, or it's just something that's a bit of a substitute for your brother. So you might throw your phone at the wall, you might punch the door, you might rip something off the wall and slam cupboards, anything like that. You're taking out that energy on something else because it's not appropriate to take it out on the actual target of the emotion.
Or even other people as well, because it can always...
Yeah, and pets as well.
So the next personality trait we've got is sublimation. So what's sublimation?
Sublimation is really similar to displacement. So it's like you can't take out this energy on what you want to take it out on, but instead of displacing it onto like an object, you sort of redirect it towards something positive. So sublimation could be you develop a new hobby, or you get really into work and you become really productive at work. So you redirect that energy towards something that other people would approve of.
So it's almost trying to get kind of like gratification from other people as a way of dealing with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, or as a way of...
Or maybe even your own opinion, like the way that you see yourself. You don't want to see yourself as feeling anger towards certain things. So instead, you sort of unconsciously put that energy in towards something else. It doesn't have to be about other people's approval, but it can be your own approval as well.
The final one we have is projection, which we've linked to Tiger King here and that goddamn Carol Baskin. So what's projection?
So projection is when you, again, as it always starts with, you've got uncomfortable feelings about maybe a person, but in order to deal with that, you think that they have the same feelings towards you. So if you hate somebody, the way that your ego might deal with that is by making you believe that they hate you instead. So that's sort of, it's easier to deal with somebody else hating you than it is for you to deal with the unacceptable feelings of hating them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's almost as if you need to project on someone else to maintain some sort of control.
Yeah, maybe.
So you mentioned that there were other types of personalities that we've not gone into detail here. What other key ones would you potentially raise?
So there's another defense mechanism called regression, which is where in order to deal with a certain situation that is causing stress or anxiety, you would actually revert back to a behavior that you did in childhood. So it might be, we all know when we were in high school, somebody that sucked the thumb, and it was a bit like, you're kind of too old for that, but we'll let you off. It's doing a behavior that is from childhood, such as cuddling up under a blanket in order to deal with, your marriage failing.
Or potentially having a midlife crisis, so buying a load of motorbikes, going partying down Reflex again, those kind of things could potentially be a form of regression.
Yeah, so your way of coping with growing up is you just don't face it and you go back to younger behaviours. Yes, that's regression. And then another defence mechanism is called reaction formation. And this is basically when the person has feelings, again, they deem them as unacceptable. And so the way that they deal with that is they sort of take on the opposite of these feelings. So this is used to explain when people are homophobic. If they have some sort of extreme hatred towards gay people, it might actually be because they themselves are homosexual, but they don't want to deal with knowing that about themselves. So the way that that manifests itself is through homophobia and sort of pretending that they hate gay people or that being gay is wrong when actually they are gay themselves.
So the final aspect of Freud's key ideas that we're going to look at is psychosexual stages of development. And these are critical stages within childhood that link to our own psychological development. And Fran's going to take us through the 5 key stages. So what's the first stage of the psychosexual stage of development?
Yeah, there are 5 different stages. And what Freud thought was that the child is born with a certain amount of energy, and this is kind of where it gets a little bit controversial. So he called it sexual energy, and people don't really like the thought of babies or toddlers or young children having sexual energy, and so that is why it's controversial. But what he meant with sexual energy is he just meant that it was energy that brings pleasure to the child. So if we start with the first stage, it's called the oral stage because children who are about a year old or up to a year old, they get pleasure through their mouth. So if you think about a baby who's literally a few hours old, you do not teach them to feed or to breastfeed or to suck on a bottle. They just do it automatically. And the reason that they do it automatically is because it brings them pleasure. So Freud said that the child will focus on getting pleasure through certain maybe body parts or behaviours.
And is it true that this can manifest itself in a form of regression with things like smoking or?
Yeah, exactly. So if that child is either not fed enough or they are fed too much, this will then lead to personality traits later on in life that are seen as negative. So if, let's say, for example, a mother does not feed her child enough, so whenever the child is crying for food, she might try and comfort the child in different ways, or she might just leave the child alone. Or the complete opposite, the way that I stop my child from crying is just by feeding it again and again and again, and not thinking about, oh, maybe it's uncomfortable and it needs a nappy change, or maybe it needs attention, or maybe it needs something else. Just the way that I deal with my child's crying is I just feed it. So these are two things that will cause conflict in the oral stage. And then later on in life, it will cause things like smoking or maybe overeating or anything that is to do with the mouth that is like a way of coping with stress. So like people smoke when they're stressed, don't they? Once the child has moved through the oral stage, they then go into the anal stage. I love his naming of it.
Yeah, I know.
Like the
Could have thought of a
stage,
better
right?
one, but maybe back then the connotations it does today.
Well, he's from Vienna, so maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's just like a translation of it. So the child then goes into the anal stage, which is, if you think about if you've ever been around really young babies, they, in the first year of life, they wear a nappy, so they can wee and poo wherever they want. They just do it whenever they need to do it. Then this sort of, this time comes in their life where they're told, no, you need to do it in this particular way, in this particular part of the house. And the child will see that there's such a focus on where they go for a wee and a poo. It's like, well, I used to be able to do it wherever I wanted and you just took care of it. Now I have to do it in a potty in the bathroom. So there's a huge focus on where you go for a wee and a poo. So Freud picked up on this and he said that when the child is about 2 years of age, a little bit older, they start to go through potty training. And so that is where the focus of pleasure is on. It's on the bottom. So they get pleasure from going for a wee and a poo. And again, if the parent treats them, if they sort of punish them for not doing it in the right way, in a really punitive sort of way, if they like shout at them or they smack them or they tell them off for not doing it in the perfect way, then again, that is going to lead to conflict and it's going to lead to certain personality traits later on. When you just call someone anal because they're a bit of a perfectionist.
Yeah.
Like anally retentive.
Anally retentive is the phrase.
Yeah, so that has come from Freud's stages of development. So it's almost like they were told off too much. Their parent was too punitive about where they went to the toilet. So they sort of saw this as being like, they need to be really controlled about this behaviour. And so the way that it manifests itself later on in life is they are anally retentive. Or the opposite of that, if it's like you can wee and pee wherever you want, or they don't get potty trained at the right time and it's sort of left for too long, then they might be a bit messy and they might be, just like they don't really care about how they appear to other people and they just do whatever they want.
The next stage of development is probably the one most people are familiar with, which is the phallic stage, or as it's sometimes referred to as the Oedipus complex.
Yeah, so the phallic stage is where the focus is no longer on the mouth, it's no longer on the bottom, it's on the genitals instead. So boys and girls will start to notice the physical differences between genders. They'll start to notice that I have a certain body part and other people have a different body part. So they really start to notice these differences. And so they start to try and explore it a little bit more and they start touching those body parts. As they start to sort of do this exploring and they start to talk about these differences that they've noticed, the parents will pick up on this and they will actually sort of be punished a little bit for focusing on that body part because the parent doesn't like the idea of the child touching that part of their body. As well as sort of thinking about that part of their body, as you said, they start to develop the Oedipal complex. Now, it's different for boys and girls, but for boys, what this means is they will start to develop incestuous feelings towards their mother, so the parent of the opposite sex.
So I think it's worth pointing out that the reason it's called the Oedipus complex is because it's based on a Greek myth where essentially the lead character Oedipus ends up killing his father because he's harboring negative emotions towards his father and actually marrying his mother in a very incestuous way. So Freud's building off this this myth and developing it as part of his stages of development.
Yeah, so that's why he called it the Oedipus complex, because the boy will have hatred towards his father because he knows that his father has sexual relations with his mother, but the boy would want to possess his mother, and he basically doesn't want the father to have anything to do with his mother.
For a lot of my friends, they kind of say that a lot of boys they meet online are stuck in this stage. They end up being tied to their mother's apron strings, which links to this idea of an Oedipus complex, right?
Yeah, so the way that the boy would deal with this negative feeling, because the boy doesn't want to have hatred towards his father, and he doesn't feel comfortable with having these feelings towards his mother. So the way that he deals with that is he just becomes like his father. So you can see in the picture we've got a boy who's like shaving like his dad. So he just thinks, right, it's sort of like the next best thing is I will just become like my father instead. So this is linked to theories about gender. We explain our gender development in terms of identifying with the same-sex parent and just becoming like them instead. So that's the Oedipus complex.
How about the Oedipus complex for women? So obviously we've looked at it for boys, but he has a particularly strange take on it when it comes to women, doesn't he?
Well, yeah, for women, he didn't really do that much research into how the gender development is for girls. But he basically said it was probably the same sort of thing. So girls will notice that they do not have a willy. So he said that they developed penis envy. So
another one of Freud's key phrases that finds its way into daily discourse.
Yeah, penis envy. It's like, I don't have a willy, but you do, and I want one of them. So a girl will develop penis envy and she will sort of feel inferior to males. And again, she will have these incestuous feelings towards her father and hatred towards her mother. The way that she deals with this is she realizes, I'm never going to get a penis. It's just not something that I'm going to develop throughout my life. So instead of that, I will become like my mother and I will instead have a baby. So rather than wanting a penis, they want a baby instead. So this is one of the reasons that it's very controversial, because people are just like, what? That makes no sense. Why?
Yeah. And it links with that idea of lack as well, which has been subsequently criticised in Freud's theories. So the next stage we've got is the latency stage. So what's the latency stage?
So the latency stage is there isn't actually a body part that is being focused on. The energy that would have been focused on a certain body part becomes dormant. So Freud said that rather than focusing on certain behaviors, we will sublimate it. So if you remember from the defense mechanisms, we're talking about sublimation. We will instead sublimate that sexual energy towards things like schoolwork, hobbies, maybe doing sports, making friendships. We will put that energy towards more socially acceptable things, and it sort of becomes dormant for a really long time. And then up until about the age of 16, the person will be in the latency stage, and then they'll go into the genital stage, which is quite similar to phallic in that it sort of becomes focused on sex and the genitals, but the person starts to focus on coming into a relationship with somebody else and having sexual relations with another person.
Okay, so that's when you finally reach your psychosexual maturity.
Yeah, that's when you mature, when you've got through all of that.
Does everyone get there?
Everybody gets there, but some people in worse states than others.
I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
So let's break this down into some key conclusions then. Well, the first one is that psychoanalysis can be used to break down and understand the mind, particularly the unconscious processes of the mind. And it can also be used to treat neuroses rather than psychoses.
A neuroses is a disorder such as, well, the main ones are depression and anxiety. But a psychosis is defined as something that is like a disconnect from reality. So schizophrenia is an example of a psychotic disorder because the person is suffering from severe hallucinations that aren't real or delusions that again aren't real. So a psychosis is like a complete disconnection from reality, whereas a neurosis is like you are still connected to reality but in a more negative way. But you don't perceive reality completely differently to how everybody else does. So psychoanalysis would help people with things like anxiety and depression, but it wouldn't help people with schizophrenia because it just wouldn't be suitable to get people to talk about their relationships when they're being affected by schizophrenia.
And finally, the aim of psychoanalysis is to help uncover the unconscious and allow you as the individual to understand yourself. And this can be done through the various methods that we have described in the lecture today. So that could be through the unconscious and the model of the unconscious, the id, the ego, superego. It can manifest itself in forms of defense mechanisms, and it can also manifest itself in forms of psychosexual development. But what do you think about Freud? Do you think he was right? Do you think, like a lot of people, Freud has moved into a level of irrelevance? Let me know down below in the comments. Fran, what do you think about Freud? Do you think Freud's still relevant?
I think he's been useful, but I don't think he's relevant anymore because I think he was useful in showing that childhood is really important for your development. I think that he brought good ideas to therapy. So before that, it was sort of like doing techniques on the patient and them not really having anything to do with it. But what Freud brought in was the idea that the patient should talk as much as they can and sort of give their own take on their own dreams or their own thoughts that they've had. So he brought in that, but I'd like to think I'm a bit more of a modern psychologist, so I'm more scientific than Freud. And all of the methods that Freud used to develop his theories were completely unscientific and subjective. And so for that reason, I'm not a fan.
Fran is not a fan of Freud.
Fran is not a fan.
Okay, don't forget to like and subscribe. Drop us a comment if you have anything to add, and I will see you next time.